50 years ago, the human set foot on the moon for the first time. Now it's time for an even more ambitious moonshot, reversing climate change while ensuring that people and nature thrive. The last IPCC and IPBES reports were alarming. We are on the verge of a climate breakdown and a biodiversity collapse. We are losing almost 200 species every day. And with the current emissions, our carbon budget, it's probably less than 10 years. Some leading scientists have been looking for the roadmap that we must follow if we want to remain under 1.5 degrees of temperature rise. And they identified that if we are to achieve the Paris Agreement, we must start halving emissions every decade, starting next year, until 2050, while we also increase carbon removal. And it's not a small challenge, especially when we consider that population is still growing. We'll soon be 10 billion people on this planet, all in need of food, water, shelter. And as we discussed earlier today, we'll only achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN if we leave no one behind. Luckily for us, there's been some changes in the business sector as well. They're starting to realize that delivering impact is not only a nice thing to have, but rather a condition of success. And I'm not the only one saying that. As you can see from those two very leftist and equal warrior magazines that published these covers very recently. So, with Good Tech Lab, my company, I've been looking at how impact tech can be used as a leverage point to reply to those planetary emergencies that I mentioned before. We mapped over 180 examples and opportunities for technology and impact to help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, from food to water, education, and poverty. And I'll give you 3 examples from the food sector to make it more illustrative. The first one, which is skipped. Okay, I'll give 3 examples then, which are not the same that I thought of in the beginning. Apparently the slides slightly changed. I'll start with Insect. Insect is a French company, a French startup, producing insect proteins in very large scales, in big, large-scale farming. And they are using machine learning algorithms to optimize its production, which is very good, because it actually has a much lower carbon footprint than other alternatives for animal feed, especially for aquaculture. The second example that I have here is Notco, which is a Chilean startup using also machine learning to map and discover how to best combine plant proteins to emulate the taste and texture of animal proteins. So they are creating plant-based alternatives and non-dairy products for people who, like me, are concerned about the impact of what they're eating. And finally, I have here an example which is not so much food-related, but rather related to climate. Pachama is looking for how we can use carbon capture and storage with forests, and using machine learning, they are optimizing how forests are actually planted. And as my colleague just said before, also based on blockchain, they are verifying that the forests that are being planted are actually creating the impact that they are claiming they are. So those are just 3 examples of impact tech solutions replying to SDGs. There are plenty more. And the key aspect of it, now that you already understood the size of the problem and how tech can be a leverage point, is to understand how do we fund all that, right? And that's a big issue, because according to the UN, we still have a 2.5 trillion financial gap for the SDGs. If before, like hundreds of years ago, the financial sector was mainly looking for profit, and it started looking for profit and risk, well, now it's time for it to look for profit, risk, and impact. And there are many opportunities in there. impact investing is a 502 billion impact class right now. It started as a mainly private equity and private debt, and mainly in emerging markets. But now it's spread all over the globe, and very different types of assets, including venture capital, and also looking a lot on innovation and technology. What is impact investing? So impact investments are investments that look to create, which have the intention to create measurable, positive, social and environmental impact alongside financial returns. So they're looking for both at the same time. One of the key issues is that even it's already $502 billion, it's still a niche class, as much as impact tech for the tech sector, and we want this class to grow. And for that, we need a lot more actors and a diversity of actors to engage in the sector. Prime Coalitions is working on that, bringing more foundations to support early-stage innovation. Early-stage innovation is a part of the innovation spectrum that really needs a lot of support. And one of the alternatives is for foundations to provide, for instance, catalytic capital to de-risk those innovations that can be breakthrough innovations, really changing the sector, how it works, and delivering big impacts for then, afterwards, longer in the chain, other bigger investors provide more money for it to scale and reach new markets. For early-stage innovation, which I said is a big challenge still, a trendy instrument is venture capital. It's very risky. That's why people expect a lot of returns on it. Usually the expectations is for 10x returns after 10 years. And for that, investors are always looking for what they call the unicorns, meaning that those startups that will have a billion-dollar valuations. The thing is that often VCs do not achieve those targets. And then it comes to a second issue, which is that one of the questions regarding the VC model is that it's often claimed to be a little bit too much focus on the valuation rather than on the value creation or even the commercialization and commercial market of the companies, let alone impact, as I was saying before. So another issue of that is that it's really dedicated to hyper-growth companies, which does not suit many other initiatives that might need a little slower progression. So that's why some movements like the zebras that maybe some of you have heard of are now claiming that an alternative to the unicorn model, we should be looking more of what zebras are, which means they are real, which means they actually thrive in groups, so very different from the winner-take-all model that the venture capital usually praises for, and that they are both black and white, meaning that they can at the same time deliver positive impact and profitable returns. Some investments are switching a little bit the model also to adapt to these ideas, or even those that are very committed are attached and conditioning their returns to the impact that the portfolio is creating. And with that comes a very important question, right? So we're talking a lot about impact. What exactly does it mean? The Impact Management Project has defined 5 dimensions of impact. What is impact? Who is this initiative impacting, meaning is people who are really underserved or not? How much? So is it a very large scale or is it very deep impact? The contribution, or is it really changing something, or maybe the conditions in the ecosystem changed and the outcome would have happened anyway, independently of the intervention that is being created? And what are the risks that come attached to the technology that is being created, or project, or whatever? Those 5 dimensions are the result of a consensus of more than 2,000 organizations and leaders about what we should consider when we talk about impact. But there's still another critical issue. It's how do we collect the data that is necessary to analyze this impact that we're claiming? And for that, we're also seeing innovations. One of them is the lean data approach that are developing survey tools for grassroots communities to report back what are they really experiencing on the fields in a very transparent and cheap way. But it's not only about the access to data, as it was already discussed before, it's also how do we make this data interoperable? How do we make sure that the data that exists out there, they always have the same format, and that the semantics of it, or when we think about words like poverty, how do we make sure that they mean the same thing for different people? If we achieve that, then it might be much easier for us to use machine learning algorithms and other instruments to analyze and process this data much faster and come to the conclusions which are much more coherent and very important if we are to achieve the moonshot that I mentioned in the beginning, which is a serious emergency. We're really facing an existential threat right now. And we have millions of people already on the streets asking for this change. Changing in our economic system right now might be one of the biggest opportunities in history, but it might also be our last. So let's do something and start changing it and acting right now. Thank you.